Okay, JLL, your fairly new North America data center report for mid-year 2025. I think the highlight seems to be, or the main finding, that there's a growing data center availability crisis. I think crisis is the word you use. So what's causing it? I mean, I guess we know about the AI explosion, but is that the only reason, or what are there other things going on in the background?
In simplest terms, the technology is moving very, very quickly, and the real estate industry is just unable to keep up with that pace. There are other challenges, namely power, which is restricting the pace at which we can develop. But just generally speaking, the technology is moving very quickly. Demand, both from corporate businesses as well as individuals, is also increasing very quickly, and just the real estate development can't keep pace.
Okay, and in terms of the sort of the landscape, I believe Virginia, the report says Virginia is still the largest data center market by quite some way in the US, followed by, is it Dallas, Fort Worth? Are there any reasons to think that that dominance is going to change at any time soon, or is that going to remain pretty much as is?
Yeah, Northern Virginia for many years has been the number one market, and based on demand in the pipeline, we foresee that remaining intact. It is 2 or 3 times larger than the next largest, being Dallas Fort Worth. Now, in terms of if we look over a longer period of time, the number 2, 3, 4 market positions in the United States, there has been some movement in that over time, but Dallas has been pulling away. And based on the pipeline there, we see Dallas really solidifying itself as the number 2 market through the end of this decade. But then from there, there's a number of other markets that are players, the Pacific Northwest. There's a lot of activity there. Texas in general, outside of Dallas, if you think about West Texas, also down in San Antonio and Austin, very busy. If we move a little farther west into Arizona as well, a lot of activity there. I sit in Chicago, Illinois. We cannot forget to talk about the Midwest. Plenty of activity as well. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, and in terms of the folks, if you like, responsible for the activity or most of it, it seems to be that the cloud companies and technology providers. I think the report suggests that at least two-thirds of all the activity is down to them. Is that a steady percentage, or is that increasing? Just yeah, tell us just how important those folks are to the overall data center market.
Yeah, at least over the last few years, you are correct. The cloud providers and technology firms have been accounting for between 50 and 60% of demand. But there are, besides that, the other 40%, a diversity of corporate America, also in corporate Europe, if you will, that make up the balance of that demand across healthcare and utilities and the legal and professional services sectors. But generally speaking, to your question, do we see that ratio, if it will, change over the next couple of years? And we really do not. If we think about cloud providers in particular, there is a shift that has been taking place in our industry for many years. We see that continuing, which is an outsourcing of technology services to the cloud. The technology itself is just getting so sophisticated and moving at such a rapid pace that for a number of reasons, it is advantageous for enterprises to shift increasing amounts of their workloads to the cloud. And that supports our thesis on continued growth, both in hyperscale as well as just general cloud service providers.
Okay, and perhaps returning to the sort of the fact that you say the data center industry is not able to keep up with the pace of technology. I mean, how competitive is the landscape? When it comes to data center companies trying to build out more capacity, I think you mentioned power availability, is land, construction, just personnel. What are the bottlenecks, if you like, when it comes to building out as quickly as possible?
Yeah, it is power. By far is the primary restrictor or governor on development. There are a number of developers and companies that have strong resumes and talents and skills to build facilities. It's just the pace at which they can get quantities of power to build. So we mentioned this in the report, but on average, lead times now for a utility connection are 4 years in the United States. There are pockets and anomalies to that, but as a general rule of thumb across the US, we're working with both developers and enterprise clients looking to secure new sites for development. That is roughly the time frame that we're looking at. Now, there is a significant part of our sector that's opened up in the last few years, which is land development. And some of that is on the tail end of an immense amount of land speculation that we have seen. We have land speculators and come in, particularly in rural areas, farmland, then they look to secure PPAs with a local utility provider, increase some value there in the land. That is worth mentioning. They may also secure the entitlements in terms of zoning and utilities and gas to the site. So there is value creation. And on the back end of that, most of these land speculators are not actually looking to develop a physical structure on the site. They're increasing value. They provide a service in the development chain, if you will. So there are sites across the US that have been prepared for development where either developers or enterprises could move quickly on land, on raw land, but those sites will come at quite a premium if you think about it in terms of dollars per megawatt or dollars per acre.
Okay, and I guess I mean I have to ask: is there any suggestion? Cynics might say that there's an advantage for the data center companies to sort of restrict the pipeline because they can obviously then slightly bump up their prices. If data center capacity is in short supply. I mean, is there any suggestion that that's going on, or would they all love to build out as much as they could because they can then obviously charge customers for that new capacity as well? There's no sort of suggestion of sort of deliberate restriction of capacity, no?
Yeah, that is a great question. The shorter answer is no, that if developers were able to move at a faster pace, they would be. We're talking millions, potentially billions of dollars in lease revenue that is being left on the table due to various restrictions that we've talked about in that development cycle. Vacancy across the US is around 2%. Said another way, occupancy is at 98%. Developers would love to double their size of their portfolio. Even if that means the vacancy across the portfolio slightly increases, they'd be doubling the revenue stream. So there's just, and if I were to give you another point, we've seen an increase in behind the meter power generation. In a lot of cases in the US, and another way it's called is bridge power, where operators are building the shell of a structure and then bringing in mobile and temporary power supply. Typically, these are on semi-trailers, a natural gas turbine affixed to a trailer, and they'll bring in a dozen of them to start operating the facility, even if it's at 25% of the long-term power of that facility, at least so that they can get those facilities up and running. So that's kind of an example of how developers are looking to solve the power restriction to get more supply online sooner.
Okay, perhaps just following up on that, I know that sort of small scale nuclear is becoming a potential opportunity, and I know over in here in the UK and in Europe, the time frame is a little bit, shall we say, disappointing. Is that similar in the States? Are we not looking much before 2030, or do you think sort of small scale nuclear has a potential to help with this power, the lack of power there is everywhere?
Yeah, great question. There is significant opportunity for our industry, for the world, in fact, it's just in terms of clean and abundant power as it relates to small modular reactors. Generally speaking, our view is that commercial deployment at scale will start around 2030. There are a few leading companies that have test deployments that are under review in the United States by the government for approval. Among those is Oklo, which may start at small scale deployments as early as 2028. But we do see starting into the early 2030s, significant hundreds of megawatts potentially of small modular reactor deployment in the United States. The follow-up question we typically get from clients and investors is, okay, well, where does that go? First, we see those deployments at existing nuclear sites, either operational or decommissioned. but the regulatory approvals are in place to operate nuclear power production there, right? And so it's a significant hurdle. That's where we see primary deployments of SMRs. From there, now we're talking into the late 2030s. We most likely see additional deployments in rural areas, call it, rural and agricultural America, where there's lower population density, there's less risk, and also kind of less concern, if you will, and restrictions to that new technology in that area.
Okay, so if I understand correctly, then in the short term, as you explained with the gas example, I guess microgrids and renewables are potentially going to fill some of the power vacuum shorter term. Is that fair to say?
That is fair to say, yeah. By far and away, natural gas turbines are the power source du jour for alternative or bridge power, if you will. There are other, we obviously have wind and solar, but the intermittent nature of those does not allow for that to be considered a primary power source. But it is a way for operators who have that on their site to at least put some power back to the grid and have generate a revenue stream there. In terms of primary power, fuel cells, though, that's a technology that's been around for a decade or more. There are projects that are deploying fuel cells as the primary power source. That's a fairly small percentage, maybe 5% of all data centers built in the US today. Their primary power source is fuel cells, but that's still, it's significant as an alternative. And then if we think longer term down the road, hydrogen's out there. We still need some R&D around that technology. Geothermal has small applicability, but it's interesting to monitor as well. So there are alternatives, but by far and away, natural gas turbines today are the primary alternative. SMRs present a lot of opportunity starting around 2030.
And I guess as a result of all this, I suppose once upon a time the industry's motto or the motto was build it and they will come.
Mm-hmm.
So you sort of speculatively almost put up a building and waited for, whereas now it seems to be almost for customers that if they don't commit before it's built, then they probably won't get in. Is it that much of a shift, if you like, that's what's occurred?
Yeah, it is definitely. In our mid-year report, we cite and figure it might be 73% of all developments that are currently under construction are pre-leased. Said another way, if you're building an apartment building with 100 units, 73 of those would already be accounted for and leased. So that's a significant percentage. Most these projects are on average a 2-year timeline from breaking ground until operational GPUs and the lights are on. So to already have the aggregate of that product 73% is quite amazing. It's been at around 70% pre-leased for the last 2 years, call it. So this is not a new phenomenon. It's just another indication of how tight market conditions are.
Okay, and to that point, I mean, I think you mentioned some of the areas that people are looking at outside. We talked of Virginia and obviously Dallas Fort Worth is the top two. With tier one locations, I guess just there is pressure on them in the States, globally. Are there some interesting emerging US markets where maybe land and power is both readily available and potentially not as expensive in the tier one locations?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. So, and I get that comment, or I'll see in articles often, these new markets where power is abundant and ready today. And that's rarely the case. Back to my earlier comment, on average across the US, it's about a 4-year wait time for a power connection. There are anomalies, exceptions to the rule, if you will. But the data center developers, land speculators have been combing over all acreage of the United States for a few years now, looking for opportunities. And most of that land has been optioned at minimum or secured and is under various PPA processes. So at a higher level to your question, where's there interesting activity? There's a couple things to think about. Generally in the Midwest, you have a lot of what I'll call secondary markets that have been seeing a lot of activity over recent years. Columbus, Ohio is a great example of that. If we go a little farther west into Des Moines, which is a very large hyperscale market, Minneapolis has, in the last year, has seen a lot of activity on land purchasing. There's kind of an interesting motto, a funny motto, that there's free cooling in Minneapolis, just given how far north it is. But if we head back down south into Texas, outside of Dallas, West Texas is seeing a lot of activity. Obviously, the Stargate development is there, but there are a number of other players that are circling around land sites. And I can pause there, but if there's specific market, I'm happy to talk about. But generally speaking, there is activity everywhere. Secondary markets will continue to see activity, but large markets as well. It's definitely not a zero-sum game.
And is it fair to say that the reasons for people being in the tier ones are, I mean, in certain cases, clearly they are still compelling, but they are perhaps less compelling overall than they might have been. Therefore, there is more interest in moving to alternative, what you call them, less is unfair, but tier two secondary locations, how we talk. Is that a mindset now? Whereas once upon a time, certainly in Europe, it had to be London, Frankfurt, etc. And in the States, we've obviously talked about the top two. But are people more open to building data centers in new locations?
Generally, I would say yes. If we think specifically about AI training, that is by far and away the use case for rural data center development. If we think about data center demand generally, we see the majority of demand remaining around larger markets, particularly in the colocation segment. Enterprises want to have their servers and their digital workloads close to where they have operations, in case they need to get their staff to those facilities quickly for one reason or another. If we think longer term, though, particularly as inference starts to play a larger role in our industry, then having digital infrastructure closer to those demand sources, aka population centers, will be a primary driver of site selection. So we see secondary markets continuing to grow, rural playing. There's a use case for rural, as I mentioned, but generally speaking, we see data center development continuing to center around primary markets followed by secondary markets.
Okay, so in sort of summary, is it just fair to say that data centers remains a pretty safe and attractive investment for the foreseeable future? People talk occasionally about whether this AI is a bit like the dot-com, and there might bubble and then there was clearly a crash. Then any worries that the AI, I say explosion might not be as sustainable as people think, or do you think with quantum computing coming along in the background plus AI, it's sort of death, taxes, and data centers are the sort of three safe?
Yes. Yes. I like the reference. Our forecast into 2030, which we feel confident forecasting to, we have roughly a 20% CAGR, or compound annual growth rate, on supply into 2030. And that's based on what's under construction today and the projects that we see as viable and feasible at breaking ground between now and then. Demand will keep pace with supply, just given where vacancy stands today and the pre-leasing activity. So at a high level, we see continued growth. 20% annual growth is just astonishing by really across all industries, particularly commercial real estate. I've been getting increasingly the question around bubble lately. I mean, it's been around for years, but it seems like in the last few months, it's really been top of mind for folks. What I would ask the audience to do is think about the bubble concept or discussion for equities or stocks separate from a bubble in commercial real estate. I think they're two vastly different conversations. You can argue stock valuations and pricing and multiples all day. But if we look at the fundamentals of commercial real estate, occupancy at 98%, pre-leasing at 73%. In that scenario, we do not see a bubble. Additionally, as I mentioned earlier, data center development is on average a 2-year process. So we have, high visibility out a couple of years, and that's how we feel very confident getting to forecasts that get us to 2030. Beyond then, fair game. There are base case upside, downside, but generally speaking, humanity is using. Let me take that a step back. Humanity is creating more data every year. We're also consuming more data and processing more data every year, and that trend is likely to continue. I don't see that slowing down or reverting. So we remain bullish on data centers for that situation for what is likely to be my lifetime.
And just in terms of clearly that growth, as you say, is pretty spectacular. And is that despite, this current availability crisis, is that going to get worse before it gets better, or is it going to carry along sort of at roughly the same sort of disjoint between required capacity and actual capacity? Just your thoughts as to how that bottleneck will or won't resolve itself.
Yeah, good question. We do not see vacancy meaningfully increasing before 2030. We've run some downside scenarios where the largest drivers of demand, aka the hyperscalers, if they were to slow down meaningfully in the next couple of years, almost to a stop, based on what's already been committed and demand from other industries, we still see vacancy hovering around 5%, which is still quite low. So even our downside scenario, at least into 2030, remains, market conditions do not change meaningfully. In the distance, there, I'm sure, will be new technologies that disrupt our industry, as there have been, in each decade leading up to our conversation today. And the industry will continue to adapt around that. But just, back to my earlier comment, we create and consume more data each year than we did the year prior, and I don't see that trend line meaningfully changing.
No, it's been great to chat, and thank you so much indeed for sharing so many great insights into what's going on in North American data center market. And maybe we can chat either at the end of the year or early next and see if anything's changed. But at least for now, Andrew, really appreciate your time. Thank you.
I appreciate it. Thanks, Philip.